Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Mark Kennedy Frontiers for Freedom lecture series. My name is Gunther Dingman, and I'm a student volunteer with the Eugene McCarthy Center for Public Policy and Civic Engagement. Wednesday mornings, you can find me making promotional materials, as well as other various tasks at the center. Or if it's a good day, you can find me out cleaning the ditches with the Adopt a Highway program as well. I'm a junior political science and communication double major. That means I'm going to be writing a lot of papers. On campus, I'm a cadet in the ROTC program and have been lucky enough to travel to Bonn, Germany, and I plan to again travel to Poland this year for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So really excited about those opportunities as well. And then with these experiences, plus the future job that the military will provide, I have a vested interest in the future of America's foreign policy. So I can't wait to hear this lecture by Dr. Hal Brands. It's my honor to introduce the Henry A. Kissinger Distinguished Professor of Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Dr. Brands has received his BA from Stanford University and his PhD from Yale. He's gone on to author and edit several books, including his latest works, American Grand Strategy and the Age of Trump, and Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft and World Order. He has served as a special assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Strategic Planning and been on a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow. He was also consulted with a vast array of intelligence and national security communities and was the lead writer for the Commission on the National Defense Strategy for the U.S. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Dr. Hal Brands.
Well, thank you, Gunther, and thanks very much also to the McCarthy Center and particularly to Professor Lindstrom for welcoming me here today. So I'm going to try to keep my formal remarks, my quasi-formal remarks, relatively short because my guess is that the subject today, so how foreign policy will be affected by the midterm elections last night, my guess is that subject will provoke a fair amount of discussion and interest, and so I want to leave plenty of time for questions and discussions and commentary. So what I'm basically going to do for the next 20 minutes is two things. So first, I'm going to lay out how I think about foreign policy under the Trump administration as it has unfolded over the first nearly 2 years of Trump's presidency. And then I'll talk about what I think some of the effects that the midterm elections will have on the course of U.S. foreign policy over the next 2 years. So to start with the first piece of that, sorry? Aha. All right, so to start with the first piece of that, I think that understanding Trump's foreign policy and understanding a lot of the controversy that has surrounded it requires understanding what that foreign policy is seen to challenge or what it is seen to threaten. And the way I would define that is the president's foreign policy is seen to threaten the post-war tradition of American statecraft, which is also sometimes referred to as the liberal international order. And when we talk about international orders or international systems, that's really just an academic term for the set of power arrangements and institutions and dynamics that shape interactions between the players in the international system. But since 1945, we've had a particular type of international order that has been anchored by a particular type of U.S. foreign policy. And the international order that we've had has been referred to as liberal because it's based on liberal economic and political concepts. And I'm saying liberal not in a left-right, Democrat-Republican sense, but sort of in a classically Lockean liberal framework. Emphasizing the freedom of the individual, emphasizing economic liberalism, and so on and so forth. And it's been a U.S.-led international order in the sense that the United States has been the primary player in building and maintaining that order over time. And so since World War II, there's been lots of change in U.S. foreign policy on a year-to-year or administration-to-administration basis. But sort of the 50,000-foot level judgments and policies that the United States has had and has pursued have remained relatively constant. Between 1945 and 2016, every American president thought that the United States had a vested interest in promoting the expansion of freer trade around the world. Every American president thought that the United States had an interest in preserving stability and favorable balances of power in key regions like Europe and East Asia and the Middle East. Every American president thought that the United States had an interest in preserving, at the very least, preserving an international environment in which democracy could flourish, and perhaps even more actively promoting democracy and human rights abroad. And so these were the policies that really underpinned the international system that took root after 1945. And all of these policies were underpinned by what you might think of as a positive sum logic. And so the idea wasn't that the United States could only be secure by making other countries insecure, that it could only be prosperous by making other countries poor, but actually that we could become most prosperous and most secure by helping like-minded countries, so countries that basically shared our aims and at least some of our values, helping them become more prosperous and secure and stable as well. And so that was sort of the ethos of U.S. foreign policy for several decades. And you would have to say that it was pretty successful, because by any reasonable historical comparison, the years since 1945 have been some of the best years in human history in terms of the spread of respect for human rights and democracy, in terms of the growth of global and American prosperity, just in terms of the fact that we haven't had another global depression or another global war since World War II. And not all of those things resulted solely from American foreign policy, but American foreign policy was a necessary, if not sufficient, contribution to those accomplishments. So that's what's in the background. Now Donald Trump comes along, and during the 2016 campaign in particular, Trump really seemed to position himself in opposition to this traditional American role in the world. And this often took the form of what you might consider unorthodox policy proposals. So there was the often expressed interest in striking up a friendship with Vladimir Putin. There were all the critiques of American allies and the threats to leave them in the lurch if they didn't increase their payments to the United States. There was the idea that the United States should launch trade wars against China and other countries, that we should withdraw from existing trade agreements, even ideas that we should essentially take Iraq's oil with us somehow after we concluded the counter-ISIS mission. And so all of these ideas were controversial in their own right, but I think what they spoke to was a deeper intellectual discomfort on the president's part with the premise, the fundamental premise of the post-war order. And the president really seemed to operate more on a zero-sum logic, on a win-lose logic, the idea that the United States had been exploited by the nations it had protected, that it had been exploited by the system that it had helped to create, and so it had to start acting more ruthlessly if it was going to start winning again in international politics. And not just more ruthlessly with respect to U.S. competitors or adversaries, more ruthlessly with respect to American allies and key trading partners as well. And this was really the central intellectual thread that ran through the president's foreign policy pronouncements during the campaign. So that was the campaign. Then January 2017 comes along, and the presidency begins. And I think the first thing you have to acknowledge in evaluating Trump's foreign policy is that President Trump has been less radical than candidate Trump was. He's been constrained by a number of factors, by relatively mainstream advisors within his administration, by the Congress on some issues, simply by inertia or international reality and others. And so what we've seen since January 2017 hasn't been sort of an explosion in American foreign policy. And in fact, you can point to a variety of areas where the president has pursued either status quo policies or policies that we probably should have expected from any Republican president. So the president initially wanted to pull out of Afghanistan. He ended up increasing the number of U.S. troops there modestly instead. The president did not end up embracing the carpet bombing of ISIS. He largely continued the campaign that had been started under the Obama administration. The president ended up enforcing President Obama's red line in Syria after a couple of chemical weapons attacks there. There was no withdrawal from NATO. There was no withdrawal from the WTO. NAFTA was threatened repeatedly, but it was ultimately renegotiated and doesn't look a whole lot different now, even though it has a different name than it did a couple of years ago. And so there has been more continuity than one might have expected if one took everything that the president said seriously during the campaign. And so there has emerged an argument that not a whole lot has actually changed in U.S. foreign policy. That's a reasonable argument, but I disagree for two reasons. And the first is that there still have been areas in which the changes in U.S. policy have been concrete and they've been significant. And so I'm just going to list four here, or five here, I guess, but the list goes on. So the United States has withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a multilateral trade deal that it really played the foremost role in negotiating in the first place. It's withdrawn from the Paris Climate Change Accords. It's withdrawn from the Iran nuclear deal. We have initiated something like a trade war with China, with escalating tariffs and tensions over the past 2 years. We've also launched something like a trade war against a number of our allies. And so the steel and aluminum tariffs that went into effect a number of months ago were in place not just against countries that you would think of as competitors like China, but they were in place against a number of close American allies in Europe and Asia as well. And the list can go on and on and on. And I would acknowledge that we can argue, reasonable people can argue about whether these are the right policies or the wrong policies to pursue. I'm more critical of a lot of these decisions, but there are smart people who think the other way as well. But nonetheless, there's been significant change here. But I would actually argue that the more significant changes in U.S. policy have not been in the realm of concrete policy decisions. They've been more in the realm of intangibles. And so I think you can identify 4 or 5 areas in which the tone of American foreign policy has changed in a significant way, in which the ideas underpinning American foreign policy have changed in a significant way, in which key relationships have been challenged in a significant way, none of which has dramatic near-term effects, but all of which will have significant and, to my mind, damaging effects over the long term. And so let me just list 5 areas very quickly. I think that this administration has really eroded the perception of the United States as a reliable and committed ally, certainly in Europe and also and elsewhere. And there are a variety of behaviors that I think have contributed to this, but the two I'll just flag are the president's repeated questioning of the U.S. Article 5 commitment to NATO, the article of the Washington Treaty that basically says we'll treat an attack on one as an attack on all, as well as the fact that the administration has actually been quite hostile to the European Union, which is essentially the counterpart to NATO in terms of our relationship with Europe. I think that we have also eroded the perception of the United States as the world's foremost supporter of democracy and human rights. Again, this is where you sometimes have to draw a distinction between the president and the rest of the administration. But the president has certainly been more forward-leaning and sort of hugging tyrants and holding democratic allies at arm's length than we've seen at some time. A third area is that I think that the United States has sort of retreated from its role as the leader of first resort in dealing with pressing international problems. And so at its best, the United States has been like the first responder running toward the fire over the past 70 years. We've been sort of the critical organizer and catalyst of collective action and dealing with the most challenging international problems, from rebuilding Europe after World War II to taking on the Islamic State more recently. But at least on an array of issues, this administration has basically said, we're not interested in doing that anymore. And you could certainly point to climate change and migration, which has both geopolitical and humanitarian effects, as 2 examples of issues where we have retreated significantly. I think there's also been an erosion of perceptions of just basic American steadiness and competence in global affairs. I think that the chaos that seems to come out of the administration, particularly the White House on a day-to-day basis, the president's penchant for issuing offhand threats and pronouncements in a way that often confuses even people within his own administration, all of that has a toll on the global idea of the United States as a country that it can essentially handle its foreign policy with a high degree of reliability and skill. And then finally, I think that we're paying a price in terms of soft power. So America's influence has not just rested on our unmatched economic might or our military power. It's rested on the perception that the United States is a flawed but nonetheless admirable society, and that we represent universal values around the world. But if you look at both, you look at a number of things that are coming out of the administration, everything from deeply and in some ways xenophobically anti-immigrant rhetoric, the denigration of foreign countries in Africa and elsewhere, a variety of other issues. I think that we are spinning down that soft power relatively rapidly. And this is not just my impression. If you look at polling on this subject, global perceptions of sort of favorability of the United States fell markedly just in the first 6 months of the Trump administration. That was before Charlottesville. That was before a whole host of other incidents. So I want to be clear when I talk about these things that there actually are some aspects of the president's foreign policy that I think are more constructive than not. And so I'll just give one example. I think this administration has been far more candid in talking about the challenge that China poses to American interests in the geopolitical and the economic realm than any previous administration since the Cold War. And so I think they should get a fair amount of credit for that, even if sort of the strategy to support that rhetoric is not entirely in place. And there are other areas where I'm broadly supportive of the president's foreign policy as well. But in general, I worry that the United States has been dissipating the qualities that have made it an attractive and broadly acceptable leader in the world and that have helped to hold together the world order that's been so productive. And I worry that this is going to get worse with time. Okay, so that's the backdrop with respect to U.S. foreign policy under the Trump administration. Now I'll give you my thoughts on how the midterms are going to affect all this. One thing to keep in mind here is that midterm elections are almost never decided by foreign policy issues, but every midterm election nonetheless has implications for U.S. foreign policy. And I think yesterday's midterms were watched particularly closely by observers around the world, in Europe and Asia and elsewhere, because I think people recognize that in the current moment, the global stakes of our internal political decisions have really never seemed higher. And so we now know the results of the midterms. So the Democrats picked up a modest majority in the House. They're probably going to end up with about 230 seats. The Republicans held and slightly increased their majority in the Senate. It's not quite clear whether that's going to be 2 or 3 seats at this point. None of these results are going to fundamentally change how the U.S. approaches the world under President Trump. But what it is going to do is empower the Democrats in several key areas, which I'll talk about. And I think it's going to at least temporarily reassure international observers who are still trying to figure out where the United States is headed in the current moment. And so I'll just start by talking about the things that aren't going to change. I think the broad outlines of the president's foreign policy, whether you love them or hate them, are not going to change. Trump is not going to significantly alter who he is or how he approaches foreign affairs. And the Democrats who control or will control 1/2 of 1/3 of the government aren't going to have the power to make him shift course. And so House Democrats aren't going to be able to make the president rejoin the Iran deal or the Paris Accords. This election is not going to lead to Trump's impeachment and removal from office unless we get a Mueller report that is far more explosive than the revelations that have come out so far have been. And then finally, I think that the Democratic House leadership is really not going to give much of an airing to some of the more radical foreign policies ideas that were expressed by some of the more progressive House candidates. And so there was a lot of talk sort of on the progressive wing of the party about forcing a break with Israel over settlement building and perhaps even sanctioning Israel as a so-called apartheid state. That's not going to go anywhere. The Democratic leadership realizes that's political poison. But I think there are still 3 ways in which a Democratic House is going to be able to have greater sway in U.S. policy. So let me talk briefly about each of those. So the first thing is that a Democratic House is going to use its oversight powers both to make the administration's life harder and also to start articulating a Democratic foreign policy vision. And so Democrats are going to be in control of all of the major House committees, obviously, and I think they're going to use their subpoena power, they're going to use their other investigative tools to look at a variety of things. But when it comes to foreign policy, one of the things they're certainly going to look at are the shady and somewhat concerning relationships between administration officials in foreign countries, whether that's Jared Kushner in Saudi Arabia or the president himself in Russia. And I think that this is let me add a caveat here. I think that concerns about corruption and collusion are quite real. I think these issues deserve more scrutiny than they've gotten from Congress so far, but I think the trick for Democrats will be to avoid going overboard on this stuff and sort of developing a Benghazi-like obsession with issues that probably don't matter a whole lot to the average voter. That's the balance they have to strike. I think the more constructive thing that Democrats could do with control of these committees would be to use hearings to hold the administration's feet to the fire on concrete policy issues. So how much the president has given away or is planning on giving away in his dealings with North Korea over the nuclear program, for instance. To start highlighting the foreign policy dimensions of critical global challenges that have been shunted off to the side under this administration. I'm thinking of climate change in particular. And then also to start developing the broad outlines of what a democratic foreign policy platform might look like in 2020 and after. So that's one category of things that I think will change. The second category, and this is related to the first, but I'll mention it separately because it's been in the news a lot recently, is that I think that the friction in U.S.-Saudi relations is about to increase. So just as a general rule, Democrats have been more skeptical than Republicans about American arms sales to the Saudis and about support for Mohammed bin Salman's military campaign in Yemen. They are going to be less susceptible to persuasion or arm twisting by the White House, which clearly wants to move past this incident, the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, and the Saudi consulate in Turkey as quickly as possible. I don't think this is going to lead to a dramatic break in the U.S.-Saudi relationship. I don't think that the Democrats are able or really interested in fully, say, suspending or terminating arms sales to Saudi Arabia, not least because this would require them to get veto-proof supermajorities in both houses that they're not able to get. But I do think that the changing balance in Congress is just going to add to the pressure to maybe impose targeted sanctions on Saudi officials who are seen to be involved with the Khashoggi killing, to wind down U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen, or to otherwise put some distance between the United States and Saudi Arabia. And this brings me to a third issue, which is that I think there's going to be a showdown over defense issues in the next Congress. The Pentagon is about to get a lot more scrutiny. And so I think that a Democratic House is probably going to revive the debate in Congress over basically the conditions and aims of American military deployments and what we think of as the war on terror. So where, how long, and for what purposes are American forces deployed in places like Iraq or Saudi Arabia? I'm sorry, not Saudi Arabia, Iraq or Somalia or Yemen. And I think that this actually could be quite constructive, because I think that our policy in a number of these places, particularly Syria, is quite muddled at the moment. And so surfacing these issues could actually force a strategic debate that could be clarifying. The more fraught issue is going to have to do with the U.S. defense budget. And so if you go back about a year, both the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Joseph Dunford, testified to Congress that DOD needed growth of 3 to 5%, budgetary growth of 3 to 5% annually in real inflation-adjusted terms over a period of at least 5 years if the U.S. was going to sustain its military advantages against growing challenges from China and Russia and other countries. And the Pentagon did receive a big infusion of cash for 2018 and 2019. So national security spending reached about $716 billion for fiscal year 2019. But the Trump administration has already started to wind this back. They've already started reducing Pentagon spending. It's going to be about $700 billion in fiscal year 2020. And I think the downward trend is going to accelerate because Democratic leaders, particularly in the House, have indicated that they see defense dollars as dollars that aren't being spent on improving the economic fortunes of the working class and the middle class at home. I actually think this is a mistake. I think that defense spending has traditionally been a tool for pulling in more individuals into the middle class in a variety of ways. But nonetheless, I think that the Democratic House is going to use its influence on the budget process to push for a budget that increases social spending and decreases outlays on defense. And then the question is, what impact will this have on U.S. foreign policy? And I think it cuts both ways. I think on the positive side, if the Pentagon has to deal with a somewhat smaller budget, it is going to have to learn to use its remaining money more creatively and more efficiently. It's going to have to stop buying things that perhaps it shouldn't be buying right now, and that could be all to the good. But we are at a particularly fraught geopolitical moment, and so if you have a smaller defense budget, that's also going to make it harder for the United States to do a lot of things that I think the Defense Department needs to do. So to recapitalize the nuclear arsenal, all three legs of the triad, to invest in conventional capabilities that are coming due for modernization, to deal with the erosion of readiness over the past decade, and also just to signal to the world, to allies and adversaries alike, that the U.S. is fully committed to defending its interests. So those are three areas in which I think we're going to see policy change or policy debates as a result of Democrats taking the House. And the last thing I'll just say is that as important as all these concrete issues are, I think the most important impact from a foreign policy perspective of Tuesday's midterms may be more symbolic than substantive. And so really since November 2016, countries around the world have been trying to figure out whether the president and his America First agenda represent the harbinger of things to come in American diplomacy, or whether they are simply an aberration. They're simply a temporary departure from the way the United States does business in the world. And I think had the Republicans held both the House and the Senate, and had they done so in an election that the president really managed to make mostly about himself in a lot of respects, I think that those results would have been interpreted overseas as an affirmation both of his agenda and his style of politics. And I think that you would have seen populist, illiberal movements in Europe in particular would have interpreted this as a boost to their own agenda, looking at the way that the president mobilized issues like anti-immigrant sentiment to make electoral gains. I think that some of the subtle realignments that are happening in world politics, so hedging on the part of American allies like the Philippines or partners like Vietnam or others, efforts to work around the United States on issues like trade and global governance, all of those things would have accelerated. And so the fact that the Democrats took back just a single part of Congress, we shouldn't interpret that, whether you like this or not, as a decisive repudiation of Trump by American voters. I think Trump's involvement was actually fairly helpful to a number of GOP Senate candidates, as the president himself pointed out this morning. But I think it does lessen the effects that a stronger Republican showing might have had. And so what you're going to see is that more countries around the world are just going to take a wait-and-see approach to the next couple of years. So allies that have depended on U.S. leadership but are worried about where America is heading are basically going to try to keep their heads down, to preserve as much cooperation with the United States as possible, and to see what happens in 2020. And so I think that the democratic world, the liberal order, still faces enormous challenges, both internal and external. We haven't even talked about the external challenges today. And I think there are still big questions about the future of U.S. foreign policy. But I think yesterday's election results at least bought a little bit of time for the foreign policy tradition of the United States as it's evolved over the past 70 years. And so we're going to have another look at this in 2020, which will be even more impactful. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and I'm happy to entertain any questions, comments, issues of discussion that people want to raise.
Okay, so for question and answers, if you have a question for the professor, please just raise your hand. I'll come around with the mic to make sure that you get a chance to ask. And since I have the mic, I'll just kind of start us off. A quick question I have. In the wake of the midterm elections, the prospect of a compromise on policies like DACA have risen. Though DACA is a domestic policy, it has clear international affairs implications, particularly in regards to immigration. Do you think a softer tone on immigration, particularly illegal immigration, could enhance U.S. soft power around the world and in Latin America?
So I think in answer to your direct question, yes, I think it could. I think that again, this is just my personal perspective, but I think that I would characterize the way that the president talked about immigration in the 3 weeks prior to this election as demagogic and fear-mongering in nature, and I think that has a real impact on the way that the United States is perceived overseas. A big part of our identity for a long, long time, even though we have gone through periods of intense anti-immigrant sentiment in the past, has been as a country that is welcoming of foreigners. And I think that if we lose that, we will lose something essential in the way the United States is perceived around the world. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to get a moderation of the immigration debate. And the reason for this is that I think what the president in particular has discovered is that it is going to be very difficult for him to win a lot of votes in the middle of the political spectrum. His theory of victory is you have to rally as much of the hardcore base Trump voters as you can, And the immigration themed rhetoric really is key, I think, to that constituency. And so my guess is that you might get some feints in the direction of bipartisan compromise on immigration. And by the way, the Democrats are going to be handicapped on this as well, because the Democrats are captured by their base as well on issues of immigration. And so even if you could envision theoretically a grand bargain in which you get sort of a return of DACA protections, better path to citizenship, so on and so forth, in exchange for a border wall, I don't think the Democrats could say yes to that deal. And certainly people who are trying to make it through the Democratic primary in 2020 will not want to say yes to that deal. So I think we're going to get some moves sort of in the direction of cooperation, but it's not going to work out. And particularly as the electoral campaign in 2020 heats up, the president is going to go back to what's worked for him in the past.
So you outlined some concrete and intangible changes to U.S. foreign policy that have occurred under the Trump administration. Is there any way in 2020, given, let's say, somebody that's not Donald Trump is elected to the presidential office, is there any way for that individual to move forward and possibly reverse what some of these changes, both the intangibles and the more concrete, if they wished?
So I think the answer is yes and no. And first, let me just say that I think one thing that yesterday made clear is that this scenario where you get a meaningful primary challenge to the president from within the Republican Party is almost certainly not going to happen. The Republican Party has very much become the party of Trump at this point. And so you might get, a John Kasich who will throw his hat into the ring, but he's not going to do much in the Republican primary. So if you get a different president in 2020, it will be a Democrat. And I think there are areas in which the effects of the Trump presidency can be reversed fairly quickly, and areas in which it can't. So let me give you an example of the first area. So if you think back, when I was in college, it was at the height of the Iraq War debate, which was not just a domestic debate, that was a transatlantic debate. It was incredibly bitter. In some ways, it was more bitter than the debates we're having with our European allies today. There was a lot of anger on both sides of the Atlantic, and what was remarkable was how quickly all that went away in the space of about 2 to 3 years after the invasion of Iraq, because leaders on both sides basically toned down the rhetoric. We all remembered how much we needed each other in the first place. And so by 2006, 2007, there were still some scars in the relationship, but it was functioning relatively well. And so if you get a president who is out of sort of the American foreign policy traditions, who looks kind of like Hillary Clinton on foreign policy issues, or looks like George W. Bush on foreign policy issues, you will be shocked at how quickly everyone gets over the last 4 years in terms of our relationship with NATO and the EU. So that's one area in which I think that even just sort of a change of atmospherics would have an ameliorating effect pretty quickly. But there are areas in which changes have been made that are going to be more difficult to unwind. So getting out of the TPP, for instance, that was a concrete decision, and to their great credit, the 11 remaining TPP members forged ahead with that deal, and they tried to leave a way for the United States to come back into that deal in 2021 or 2025 or whenever. But this is in the middle of a pretty intense geoeconomic and geopolitical competition for influence with China and the Asia Pacific. And so even if we were to sign back up for the TPP on January 21st, 2021, this is 4 years we're not going to get back in that competition. And so there are areas in which, and there are other examples as well, but I think that there are a number of areas in which, again, whether you like or you don't like the president's foreign policy, the effects of these 4 years are going to be more difficult to unwind.
Since the only time the Article 5 of the NATO Charter has been activated was by the U.S. following 9/11, why would President Trump want to pull out of NATO, citing Article 5 as a reason?
So, I mean, let me stipulate that I don't know what President Trump's sort of deep game is on NATO. I don't know whether he would like to just be rid of it or whether he would like our allies to pay a lot more for the privilege of having the United States contribute to their defense. My suspicion is that if NATO didn't exist, he would be perfectly happy in that situation, but I can't read his mind, and so I can't say on that. But I will say, I think that what the questions the president is raising about NATO are not crazy. So, what are the questions the president has raised about NATO? Should the United States really treat an attack on Estonia or Montenegro as an attack on the United States? If that means fighting a war with Russia, and a war with Russia could potentially be a nuclear war, and there would be significant risks of escalation. That's not a crazy question to ask, right? Because the United States could absolutely survive and even thrive in a world in which Estonia was occupied by Russian troops. I think there are good reasons why we've made these Article 5 commitments, because we don't want any foreign power to be able to dominate a region that is critical to us, because we worry that if you don't oppose aggression the first time it happens, it makes it more likely that it'll happen again, and so on and so forth. But a lot of this is rooted in lessons that we learned from World War II and the Cold War, and I think those lessons are fading in people's memory. There are fewer and fewer people around who can remember what happened the last time the international system broke down. There are fewer and fewer people who can remember what it was like at the height of the Cold War. And so the concerns that the president are raising, they can be answered, I think, in persuasive ways. But I don't think they're crazy, and I think they are reflective of a broader questioning of America's global role that's happening in the population today.
This kind of goes back to a question asked earlier. And what I was wondering when you were talking in the first half kind of about how Trump's administration has kind of done some damage in terms of the view on America from an international perspective, I was wondering what kind of action you think would need to be taken in order to kind of walk back that damage. I know it's going to have some long-term effects, but I think one of the things that really makes the international community kind of look at America with this bad connotation is just the way that the administration behaves, the rhetoric that goes on. And I think the policy itself sometimes can, if it wasn't so loud and in your face, I don't think the damage would have been as bad as it is, but I think people are becoming sick of just hearing constant talk from him when it's mostly talk. Like this morning during his press conference, he's just up there saying this was the greatest day for Republicans, it was historic, when really the results weren't that good for his party. So my question basically is what do you think would actually need to be done to kind of walk that back, or if the administration right now could do anything?
So I'll put, I mean, this administration could do certain things. I don't think it will, because I think that the president is who he is, right? And he's not going to change significantly. But I think you put your finger on a significant part of it, which is that words and behavior and gestures really are important. And so if you have a president who goes out and politically attacks U.S. allies like Angela Merkel when they're politically vulnerable at home, or goes out and criticizes the U.K. after they have a spate of terrorist attacks, there's no concrete policy action being taken, but absolutely that has a significant effect on how the United States and its government is perceived. And so, if you're trying to sort of undo some of this stuff, just stopping doing some of the stuff that we're doing now would be helpful. I do think there are two other dimensions of it, though. So one is that there are a variety of issues where the administration could have achieved its policy goals, at least as it explained them, with a less confrontational sort of thumb your nose at the world approach. And so the two I will point to are the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords are, in terms of how binding they are, they're some of the weakest international accords the United States has participated in. The United States would have been free to reset its targets. I think that the administration could have done that, claimed victory, and nonetheless remained in the agreement. But I think it was sort of a point of political pride to get out of it in a way that was more damaging. Same thing with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. The Europeans were certainly willing to meet the United States halfway on a lot of the issues like ballistic missiles that we had with the agreement. We could have just stayed in it, and it would have been the worst of all worlds for Iran because we wouldn't have withdrawn from the deal, but they wouldn't have been getting any of the economic benefits of the deal because of the uncertainty. And so in many ways, that would have led to a more positive policy outcome from the administration's own perspective. But again, I think the point from President Trump's perspective was just to get out of it. And so that has an impact. And then I will say, I think that we often underestimate how important some other issues are to countries around the world. And climate is a big one here, where I think that as much of this is rhetoric, as much of it is symbolism, the fact that the United States did get out of the Paris climate change accords was really seen as a historic and potentially tragic mistake by a big part of the world. And so if the idea is to sort of get the United States back to where it's seen as being a widely respected global leader across an array of issues, coming back and playing a more constructive role on issues like climate and migration, I think, is going to be a critical part of it.
My question is, how will the split control of the House and Senate affect our foreign policy regarding the trade war with China, our relationship with Iran, and the unlikely friendship with North Korea?
Okay, so those are three big issues. So I'm gonna try to answer those relatively briefly, but I'll be skipping over a lot. So both China and Iran, I think, are going to take a wait-and-see perspective. So it's not just our allies that are going to take a wait-and-see perspective after this. So the Chinese have clearly been surprised by how intense the trade frictions with the United States have become. I think they, like a lot of other people, expected that the president would sort of settle for some face-saving deal where the Chinese would buy more soybeans and we'd forget all about it. That hasn't happened. And so I think the Chinese feel that they can withstand the pain of a trade war better than the United States can, even though in some ways they're more vulnerable because they export more to us than we export to them. And so I think their approach will be to try to hunker down, prevent tensions from getting any worse, and see what happens in 2020. I think the Iranians will take the same approach. I think that the Iranians will probably not pull out of the nuclear accord themselves. I think they will see what benefits they can get from the Europeans. They know that criticism of the president's decision to withdraw was intense on the Democratic side of the aisle. And so they will wait to see if the Democratic House can constrain the president or whether this is a harbinger of a swing back in U.S. foreign policy in 2020. On North Korea, it's a little bit more interesting. And so, a year ago, the fear of critics of the Trump administration was that the president was going to get us into a war with North Korea. Now the fear is that he's going to give away the store in negotiations with North Korea. And we're going to end up in a place where the U.S. alliance with South Korea has been significantly weakened, and the North Koreans aren't actually going to have given up their nuclear weapons or their missiles. And so I can't see deeply enough into the mind of the North Korean leadership to see exactly how they're going to approach this. My guess is they're going to keep playing the same game they always play, which is to give away just enough to keep the negotiations going, give away just enough to keep the concessions coming without fundamentally dismantling their nuclear missile infrastructure. But I think this is an area where the Democrats really are going to be in a position, and I think they will do this, to push the administration pretty hard in terms of what is its negotiating strategy. I don't know how far they're going to get because there are executive privilege issues, and so if they want to know what Mike Pompeo says to Kim Jong-un when he goes to Pyongyang, they're not going to find that out. But this is certainly an area where they're going to put more pressure on the administration.
So you had said previously that chances are Trump will become the Republican candidate in the 2020 election. What would a successful Democrat candidate have to look like?
So I think there are two theories of victory on the Democratic side, and in some ways both theories were tested last night, and one did better than the other. And so the one theory is that you've got to go back to the Obama coalition of the ascendant approach, right? Where you basically rally minorities, you rally urban dwellers, right? And you can, if you can drive up turnout enough among those groups, you can chart out a fairly progressive agenda with pretty harsh criticisms of the president, and you can ride that to victory. The other theory of victory is that you can't win unless you find a way of peeling off some of the basically Democratic or independent-leaning voters who went for Trump in 2020, white working class, either rural voters or suburban or exurban voters. And so to do that, you basically need a pretty bland candidate who is not particularly offensive to the sensibilities of people that you're trying to court. And so what does this actually mean? It probably means it's a white male governor from some middle American state, right? So, Mitch Landrieu or something like that. And you run on a fairly moderate platform, right? And I think that there were, look, we're still figuring out exactly why things happened last night and the way that they did. The progressive coalition of the ascendant approach does not appear to have fared as well as the middle-of-the-road, moderate, less confrontational approach last night. I mean, where the Democrats picked up a lot of seats, they generally ran candidates who were relatively inoffensive, who tackled issues like health care, steered clear of talk about impeaching the president and things like that. So whether or not that is the right approach to take, I think the lesson that the party leadership will take is that this is the approach you should do. And that's not to say that that's the approach that they will take, because the party leadership is not going to get to determine who the candidate is. If you have a 24-candidate Democratic primary, everyone is going to get pulled toward the progressive wing of the party, because that's where the votes you can actually mobilize in a primary are.
With Latin immigration being immigration being a currently crucial problem, will there be any compromise between the Congress, like our new Congress, or will there be like diverse situations, or what could be the outcome of this, a solution for the Latin immigration currently?
So, as I said a moment ago, I think that you can sketch out sort of theoretically what a grand bargain on immigration would look like. I think we've known for about a decade what a grand bargain on immigration would look like. It's a combination of stricter enforcement at the border with a better road to citizenship and greater protections essentially for those who are already in the United States. I just don't know that there is a centrist coalition that can push that across the finish line. I think that the politics of the issue are likely to push both parties towards their bases on these issues. And the Democratic base is opposed to any compromise on issues like a border wall. The Republican base is opposed to any compromise on issues like DACA or a road to a path to citizenship. And so this is one where the problem isn't that we can't identify the solution. The problem may be that we can't find a winning coalition that will actually get us there. And I'm not an expert on immigration or the politics of immigration, but my suspicion from looking at the way that this issue was discussed in the run-up to yesterday, my suspicion in looking at the reasons why comprehensive immigration reform has failed repeatedly over the past decade before Donald Trump ever set foot on the political stage makes me pessimistic about the chances for getting a grand bargain of that nature in the next 2 years.
Questions here?
Hello, my name is William, and my question for you is, according to your speech on President Trump's mishandling of foreign affairs, who would be a good leader that Trump could learn off of? Basically, who is a good leader that Trump can base his foreign affairs off of? Who's good? Prime example, like Angela Merkel, Justin Trudeau, any Democratic foreign affairs leader.
Yeah. I don't see the president taking Justin Trudeau as a model anytime soon after what happened in Ottawa. But what I will say, one of the comparisons that I think is in some ways apt about what the president's foreign policy could be if it were a bit more disciplined is Richard Nixon. And so Richard Nixon came into office at a time when the post-war order was under a lot of strain. He believed that the burdens needed to be redistributed within a number of America's foreign relationships. He believed that the international financial system had become unfair to the United States. And so Nixon did a lot of disruption in his time as well. So Nixon blew up the Bretton Woods system of international finance by suspending dollar-gold convertibility. in 1971. He pulled the United States back from military commitments on most of the Asian mainland by getting out of Vietnam and enunciating the Nixon Doctrine. He absolutely pushed greater burden sharing within U.S. alliances. All these things sound kind of familiar today. But I think that the difference was twofold. So one was that Nixon actually was committed at a bedrock level to the idea of U.S. leadership of this international system. He still thought it was a good thing. He just thought it needed to be tweaked. And so this was sort of, it was of a tough love variety, his approach to the subject. And I'm not sure that the current president thinks of American foreign policy in the same way. And the second was that Nixon was an incredibly disciplined character. I mean, he was a very problematic guy in a lot of respects. But he was pretty shrewd. He was systematic about setting out what he wanted to achieve and then proceeding towards that. He was disciplined in his public statements. And so he was able to sort of rock the boat without tipping it over entirely in a lot of these relationships. And I haven't seen much in the current president's behavior to make me think that he is similarly focused or disciplined. So I would hope that the president would take some lessons from Richard Nixon, although I don't know how confident I am that he will, in fact, do so.
Okay, so my question is, do you think Trump was the sole factor to dissolving the liberal world order? So thinking about like international protectionist policies like Brexit, like was Trump the reason for that? And if so, how impactful?
That's a great question, and the answer is no, right? So the international order has been under strain from a lot of factors in recent years, some of which, we've talked about the ones that are sort of internal to the United States, but there are a ton of them that are external to the United States as well. The international system is under strain because you have authoritarian countries like Russia and China that were never fully committed to, they never fully bought into the international system because they saw it as threatening to them in one way or another. They've become more powerful and they're pushing back against it. The international system is under strain because of the cleavages that globalization has revealed in countries around the world. And so it's not just in the United States that you have a surge of populist sentiment, right? We're seeing that across Europe right now, as you pointed out with respect to Brexit. The international system is under strain because the spread of democracy has stalled and has actually started to recede a little bit at this point. And we're seeing authoritarian models come back, not just in sort of developing regions, but even in the heart of the democratic world in places like Europe and elsewhere. And so there's a different version of this talk I give, and the point I make there is that the reason why the current moment feels so fraught, it feels so contingent, is that you have both external pressures on the international system and internal weaknesses coming together at the same time. And that's why it feels like the tectonic plates in the international system are shifting so profoundly. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.